According to the Bible, the Jews first emerged from Mesopotamia. The patriarch Abraham and Sarah lived in the region of what would be today Iraq, and they follow the Fertile Crescent up into what would be today Syria, and then they descend into Israel proper. They make some temporary sojourns in Egypt, but it is only under their grandson Jacob, with his large family, that the Jews actually move there en masse and are eventually enslaved. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with, of course, the famous story of the Exodus, which is the second book of the Bible. And that talks about how the Jews enslaved cry out to their God, who sends a redeemer, Moses, and then brings them out of Egyptian servitude, having them wander in the desert for a while until they finally cross over into the land of Israel. Archaeologists posit several other models for how the Jews may have actually settled the land of Israel, but there's no question that by the time you get to about the year 1000 BCE, there's a significant Jewish presence in the region of Israel. They've established a major religious site in Jerusalem where the temple is located, and they go through, as described in the Bible, a series of kings, some civil wars that ultimately end in the 8th century before the Common Era with a major invasion from the north that takes away the 10 northern tribes, essentially. They're the lost tribes of Israel. And then in the 6th century before the Common Era, then there's another invasion that takes away the southern region. Now, neither of these exiles, by the way, are total. There are still Jews that are living in the land of Israel, but the Jewish Commonwealth is destroyed. There's no more Jewish political entity at that point. The Babylonian exile only lasts for a few decades, however, and under Ezra, as described once again in the Bible, the Jews return to Israel. They reestablish the temple in Jerusalem that had been destroyed in the 6th century, and they begin the second Commonwealth period. The most important historical event that begins to happen in this period, the second return to Israel, is when Alexander the Great emerges from Macedonia and creates this massive empire that stretches all the way from Greece throughout the eastern Mediterranean down to Egypt and way out to Afghanistan. And he brings with him Greek culture called Hellenism. The Jews love Hellenism. They go crazy for it. It's got so many amazing things for it, but the problem is they have a difficulty figuring out how much Hellenism could be absorbed by Jewish culture without completely capitulating to Greek influence. And as a result, there is a major upheaval in the 2nd century, which is really a civil war between traditionalists on the one hand and Hellenists on the other, and this is called the Hanukkah Rebellion. And ultimately, the traditionalists win. They reestablish the traditional worship in the temple, which had been defiled by Greek gods and so on, and they start a new Jewish kingdom at that point. Now, even though the Jews have a strong measure of independence at this point, it doesn't take long before this new dynasty of Maccabean kings, the so-called Hasmoneans, begin to decline, and by the year 63 before the Common Era, the state is so weak that Pompey and his armies from Rome invade the region, and Judea becomes a client state of Rome. It is in this environment under Rome that there's tremendous factionalism among the Jewish people. There are a group called the Sadducees who basically control the temple cult. There are zealots who want to rebel against the Romans. There are the Pharisees who are essentially separating from much of the political debate and maintaining charismatic circles to try and perpetuate the Torah. Those are the people who essentially become the modern rabbis. And then, of course, there are Jewish Christians. At this point, Christianity is born. It's entirely a Jewish movement at first, and only after the first couple of centuries did it really acquire a strong non-Jewish character ethnically. And there's a lot more to say about that, but I only have 18 minutes. Okay, so the Jews rebel against Rome. They lose a major war, and in the year 70, the temple is destroyed once again. They try to rebel again in the 2nd century under a man named Bar Kokhba. Even more devastation, and the Romans take great pains to exile even more of the Jews. The Roman exile, which begins formally in the 1st century and extends through the 2nd century, becomes even more important and long-lasting than the earlier Babylonian exile.
The history of the Jews has always been stormy, with all the clashes of religions, persecution, expulsion, and conflicts. This video will trace their stories back to the time of Judah Kingdom. After the death of King Solomon in 931 BC, the united monarchy was split into the Kingdom of Israel and the Kingdom of Judah. In 722 BC, the Kingdom of Israel was invaded by the Assyrians. The remaining population fled to the Kingdom of Judah and its capital city, Jerusalem. The region was put under the control of the Assyrians for a century, until 612 BC, when the Assyrian Empire was overthrown by the Babylonians. In 586 BC, Babylon conquered Judah, Solomon's temple was demolished, and the Jews were exiled to Babylon. In 538 BC, Babylon fell to the Persian Achaemenid Empire. The new king, Cyrus the Great, decreed freedom to subjugated nations. The Jews in Babylon returned to Judah, where they rebuilt the city and organized the foundations of Jewish culture with the reconstruction of Solomon's temple and the writing of Torah, part of the Jewish Bible. 2 centuries later, Alexander the Great of Macedon made a conquest of the Achaemenid Empire. After the success, due to the death of Alexander at a young age, the empire was divided among his generals into various Hellenic kingdoms. Following the incorporation of Judea into the Seleucid kingdom in 198 BC, the crack in relations between the religious Jews and Hellenized Jews emerged. This was a time of religious struggle as the Jewish population split. Under the reign of King Antiochus IV, the Second Temple, which was built on the ruin of Solomon's temple, was desecrated due to the setup of a pagan altar to Zeus. In 165 BC, the religion-driven revolt against the Seleucid Empire and the Hellenistic impact on Jewish life had started. The success of the revolt led to the establishment of a Jewish independent rule, the Hasmonean dynasty. A century later, the Roman conquered the region, triggering 2 major revolts. The Great Revolt from the year of 66 to 73 resulted in the destruction of the Second Temple and the downfall of Jerusalem walls, except for the Western Wall only. The second major revolt from 132 to 135 led to the massive Jewish depopulation, as 580,000 Jews were perished in battle, not including those who succumbed to diseases and hunger. After this war, the Jewish communities were devastated, but the remaining population was strong and thriving in Galilee, where they migrated to after being barred from Jerusalem. The Romans gave the name Palestine to Judea, with a view to breaking the Jewish connection with the land of Israel. During this time, Christianity, which started off as a Jewish sect, ultimately became a distinct religion. It was the dominant religion towards the end of the Roman Empire. Between the 4th and the early 7th century, under the Byzantine and Visigoths Empire, the thriving Jewish community in the Mediterranean basin was subjected to the persecution and forced conversion to Christianity. After the birth of Islam, an Arab conquest began, and to some extent, the Jews supported in the hope of better conditions. They were tolerated by the Arabs. Forced conversion was only applied to polytheistic people.
This is a lecture to help you understand a little bit more about the Jewish diaspora. It seemed to be a section that people didn't quite understand, so I wanted to give you a little bit more information about it. So, the Jewish diaspora started during the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which, if you think back to the 4 empires of Mesopotamia that we talked about the Akkadian, we talked about the Babylonian, we talked about the Assyrian, and then the Neo-Babylonian. So this is the same empire of the Neo-Babylonians that we had mentioned before. You can see here on this map that the Neo-Babylonian Empire was purple. The Kingdom of Judah is this yellow area, and the Empire of Jerusalem, the City of Jerusalem, was that dot. So the Jewish diaspora during the Neo-Babylonian Empire was when some of the Jews were kept captive in Babylon. So the leader of the Neo-Babylonian Empire actually took them to Babylon, held them captive, and was not supportive of the Jewish people practicing their faith. This was a big concern to the Jews because they were worried that they would lose their religion, that the religion of Judaism would stop existing. So there were a lot of people during this time period who rose up to help start new practices to make sure that the religion of Judaism did continue. So the Neo-Babylonians were not accepting of the Jewish people. However, remember when we talked about the empires, the Neo-Babylonians were conquered by the Persians. So after the Neo-Babylonians were over, you had Cyrus the Great, And Cyrus was actually allowing of the Jews to practice their religion. So the Jews returned to Judah, back to their homeland, back to Jerusalem, and Cyrus and the Persians actually allow the Jews to practice their religion, and he actually allows them to build a temple. So this becomes the second temple of Jerusalem, so that they can practice their religion there. After the Persians, the Greeks come in, and they try to force the Jews to worship the Greek gods. The Jews rebel. There's a period of time where the Jews are fighting with the Greeks, but ultimately in 164 BCE, the Jews are able to drive the Greeks from Jerusalem and reclaim their land there. So there was never really a period of time where the Greeks fully controlled the land of Judah. The next group that took over the territory was the Romans. So now that we've moved on to the Roman Empire, we're no longer looking at the Persians. The Greeks have been completely pushed out of Judah. And then over this period of time, the land becomes known as Judea. In 63 BCE, this is the date, you won't have to know the date, but just so you understand how long ago it was and when it happened, it was in 63 BCE that the Romans came and took over this territory. The Romans were an extremely strong empire. You will come to learn about the Roman Empire in 7th grade. You'll talk all about where the Romans were and what land they came to claim. But for now, you just need to understand that the Romans came and claimed Judea or Judah. Here in purple, you can see just how much land the Romans actually came to control compared to how big the land of Judea or Judah was. So you have to understand that the Romans, like we've talked about in the past, when they see people rebelling against them, they're going to act very quickly. So while the Romans were in power, there were a lot of people that were executed under Roman rule. At first, the Romans did allow the Jews to practice their religion and to live in their own territory. And in 22 BCE, so not long after they had come to control the territory, so not long after they had come to control the territory, they appointed Herod. And Herod became a governor, and he was going to expand the second temple, and they worked on this second temple for 46 years. And then the Jews rose up against the Romans. The Jews rose up in 66 CE, so you're talking about a long period of time that the Romans allowed the Jews to live on their land unaffected. Remember, we talked about in class, you have 0, and then BCE is like negative numbers, and they come before 0, and then CE is after. So 66 CE is about 88 years after 22 BCE. So in 66 CE, it was when the Jews rose up against the Romans and decided they were ready for them to get out of their land. They thought they had a chance to fight and keep the Romans out of their land, and they were very mistaken. And if you see all this purple territory, you understand the Romans were very powerful. The Romans controlled a lot of land. So when the Jews tried to rebel, they were sadly put down, and it was Titus, who I'm sure you remember the name Titus, who was the leader, the Roman military leader, who brought 60,000 soldiers to defeat the Jews. It was nowhere needed, that number, but it was this massive show to prove to anyone who wanted to rise up against the Romans, you were going to be unsuccessful if you tried to fight against the Romans. So not only did they put down this rebellion, but they also destroyed the second temple during the 66 BCE rebellion. The Jews were horrified, and then yet in 135 CE, later another generation of Jews revolt, and this is for the last time. When they revolted, most Jews were forced onto their final exile when the Romans won and put down that last Jewish rebellion. The Romans took control of all of the Jewish territory and forbid Jews from entering Jerusalem. This is the last time the Jews go on this diaspora. So the Jews are sent to live throughout the land, and then there's this big concern that, again, the Jewish faith is not going to last and is not going to remain a religion. One of the reasons that the Jewish faith lived on through this period of time was because of people like Yohanan ben Zakkai. Ben Zakkai was a rabbi who wanted to preserve Judaism. Originally, he worked with the Jews to try to convince them to stop fighting against the Romans. He realized that the Romans were going to continue to put down the Jewish efforts, so he really tried very hard to help the Jews understand that they were not going to be successful in fighting against the Romans, but he was unsuccessful. So in order to take the next step, he decided he would actually approach the Romans and try to get the Romans to help him, or to allow for him to continue the survival of Judaism. So he had himself smuggled out of Jerusalem in a coffin, and he met with a Roman general, and from the Roman general named Vespasian, he gained permission to open a Jewish school. So other rabbis worked with him in this town of Yavne, and Yavne became this city where the Jewish school was opened. The reason that Ben Zakkai was allowed to open the school in Yavne was because he actually did this before the final uprising. He did this in the second to last uprising in 66 CE, so this was before the Romans had completely put down everything and refused to allow the Jews to enter their land. So because he had already set this up before the final exile, this allowed for the Jews to continue practicing their religion. Ben Zakkai and other rabbis then trained other people to become rabbis, to go back to their cities, to lead the worship in that city, and he made synagogues very important. And the synagogue was the place of Jewish worship. So other people went and built synagogues in their towns. And this is how Judaism was able to flourish even after the holy site in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans.
Na na na. Na na na. Hey. Na na na.